Okay, welcome to Chapter 1 in the Beyond Feelings book. Just as a reminder, this is our critical thinking book where we learn to investigate the process by which we think rather than just focusing on what we think. The emphasis is going to be more on how we think and kind of breaking that down to make sure that we're thinking in a way that is rational and reasonable and valid. So, until recently, critical thinking wasn't always taught in college. In fact, it was pretty uncommon. But as of late, organizations and businesses, people in education, and leaders in government, and in a variety of different facets have really emphasized a need for the incoming workforce to have better critical thinking skills. As an IO psychologist, one of the things that I'm told a lot by business leaders when I consult is that the the workforce that's coming in seems to kind of have problems sometimes taking initiative and being resourceful. That if they don't know the answer, then they won't necessarily look it up, or they don't really know how to go about finding out the answer, or kind of figuring out how to problem solve a situation on their own. So because of that demand, this course and others like it, there's this course offered from a philosophy perspective, and this is obviously from a psychology perspective. But at any rate, because of that demand, we now offer this course. And of all the courses I teach, this is definitely one that I think is maybe the most important. So in this class, we are going to try to focus on thought rather than feeling, less on subjectivity and more on objectivity. So I always say that emotions serve a purpose. Certainly as a psychologist, I know that emotions are necessary, and they kind of can be the salt of life, so to speak. When I had my daughter, the emotion that accompanied that day and that moment is something that I would never want to give up. However, for our purposes, when it comes to critical thinking, we're going to kind of want to check our emotions at the door and try to go into this course and this process like scientists and evaluate our thoughts as objectively as we possibly can. And the good news is the ability to think critically will not only affect your grade in this class, but it will affect every facet of your life, your schoolwork, your career, your relationships, your personal affairs, because it really plays into all of those different areas. How we think affects every single part of our lives, and a lot of it has to do with kind of shedding our ego. Most people find that what they think they know as fact automatically is not entirely accurate as they go through this course, but we kind of have these egos that tell us to be confident and defend every thought that we have. And that might not necessarily be serving us in a way that's improving or enhancing our lives. So this course is going to help us to kind of shed our ego, look at our thoughts objectively, and figure out how to use our brains to benefit us so that we can have the best lives possible. So thinking is just like any other skill. Learning to ride a bike or playing basketball or learning ballet. It can be improved with practice and by learning the different skills associated with it. So we are basically going to follow this overview or this broad brain training plan, as I call it. And so the different things that we're going to do in critical thinking is analyze. For example, if I were to tell you that 4 out of 5 dental patients recommend Colgate, you can kind of accept that passively as meaning that Colgate is the best brand of toothpaste, or you can think about it further. First of all, noticing that it was dental patients and not dentists. And then even if it was dentists rather than dental patients, maybe you say, well, what happened to that 5th dentist? Why did only 4 out of 5 recommend? Or why did only 4 out of 5 dental patients recommend Colgate? What happened to that other guy? Is this sample representative of the population? Where did they get this sample from? Did they get this sample from a country that doesn't have access to good dental hygiene or dental health care, and so they really don't have a basis for comparison? How many people were asked? Did they only ask 5 people, or did they ask 100? And this is kind of a reduced fraction of those people. Who conducted the survey? Was it people that worked for Colgate and are getting paid by Colgate to do the survey? Did they recommend any other brands? Maybe more than they recommended critical thinking. So we have a tendency to just kind of passively accept information as true. And in this course, we want to learn to really analyze and break down different assertions and different ideas being proposed to us. So the next thing that we want to do is always consider persuasion and learn that most statements are actually goal-oriented. In fact, it's said that almost all discourse has an intention. When people say something to us, there's a reason why they're saying it, or they wouldn't be saying it. And that can sound kind of cynical, but that doesn't mean that everyone's intentions are negative or malicious. Their intentions might be good. Maybe they're saying something because they want us to like them, or they want us to feel good about ourselves. Or maybe they're saying something to us because they do want to persuade us to think like them and not think for ourselves. So it can go either way, but we need to always just be kind of cognizant of the fact that persuasion exists and that it can be an attempt to manipulate our emotions or our intelligence, and therefore we need to think for ourselves. And then we need to learn to be more aware and to pay better attention, not be so lazy about the information that we're hearing. For example, I was at the grocery store and I saw this pizza that you see on the slide. And it said that it was an old Chicago-style frozen pizza. And so I just kind of assumed that it was from Chicago, but when I looked at where it was from, it was actually made in California. So just because, something says Chicago on it, because of kind of this intellectual laziness, I'm quick to go, okay, it's from Chicago. But I need to maybe pay more attention and be more aware of my surroundings and the details of the information I'm receiving. And then we also need to understand that other people that are intelligent may have an entirely different perspective than us, and we may not be aware of their perspective. Our life experiences both inform and kind of isolate us. And so it's important to consider that maybe there's information out there that we've just never been exposed to, and that's okay. So we definitely want to make sure that we're paying attention and being aware that other people have other experiences and other points of view. And the last goal of our brain training plan is to synthesize. So when people do make assertions or make claims, we want to be able to take them apart completely, look at every possible piece, consider the context in which those claims were presented to us, consider alternative perspectives and facts, and then kind of after we've broken it down and looked at all of it, put it back together in a way that's comprehensive and cohesive and makes sense. So the first step in becoming a strong critical thinker is to really become an individual, to think for ourselves. And so in order to do that, we have to first respect the fact that everyone has different perspectives and everyone can see the world differently. In fact, Gestalt psychologists created these images that you see on the slide to kind of illustrate this idea. If you look at the man on the left square picture, he looks like he's either looking at you or off to the side. And just depending on the way people's brains process information, they're going to see this initially one way versus the other way. So what I'd like for you to do for our first lecture activity today is to jot down on a piece of paper or type up which way you see the man in the image facing. Is he looking right at you, or is he looking off to the side? And then if you look at the slide or the picture in the middle, it's called the Necker cube. It's a very famous Gestalt image. And so you can either see the green square in the forefront of the cube or in the back of the cube. And if you're really good, you can kind of get it to switch back and forth. But some people will never be able to see it the opposite way of how they initially see it. And that's not an indication of their intelligence or anything like that. It's just to make the point that we see certain things certain ways based on our expectations, motivations, experiences, and if someone sees the green square in the back of the cube and I see it in the front of the cube, I can yell at them until I'm blue in the face that green square is in the front of the cube, but it's not going to change their perspective, right? Because they can only see it the way their brain allows them to see it based on the context of their life. Okay, so what I'd like for you to do for our second lecture activity, and you can just label your paper number 2, is to tell me which area you see the green part of the cube in. Is it in the front of the cube or in the back of the cube? And are you able to see it both ways? And then that last picture is also a famous illustration called the old woman, young woman picture. And it's a little bit more difficult for people to see both ways, but generally people either see an old woman when they look at the picture or a young woman, kind of her profile looking over her shoulder. For our third lecture activity today, go ahead and label it number 3, and then write down if you see the old woman or the young woman, or if you're able to see both. So again, it just depends on your life and what you've been exposed to and your experiences and your perspective and how your brain works. That's going to allow you to take in information a certain way. And so when we are thinking about becoming an individual, we just have to acknowledge the fact that everyone is different to some extent. We all do receive information differently and consider information differently. And then finally, the context in which information is given to us is also very important. If I were to say to you that, I have a friend named Stephanie, and she's my favorite. All my friends are actually named Stephanie. I don't know why. I don't seek out only Stephanies as friends. It just sort of worked out that way. I have 3 best friends, all named Stephanie. That's true. But let's say that I said one of the Stephanies is my favorite Stephanie, and she texts me every day. And she's so funny. She gets me through the day. I couldn't make it through a day without her humor and her text messages. But today, this bitch didn't text me. If I were to say that to you, and then you were to go and tell Stephanie I said that, but tell her out of context, perhaps you were to just say, oh, Professor Fell called you the B word, she's going to be offended. That's going to hurt her feelings. But if you tell her the whole story in context, that I said she's my favorite and I can't get through the day without her, then she's going to be maybe more touched and be like, oh, she called me your bitch. And it's going to be kind of a more sentimental statement than it was in a different context. So to illustrate this point, you can look at the picture on the lower right corner of the slide. And if you're to read the top row out loud, you'd probably read it as A, B, C, D, E, F. And if you read the bottom row out loud, you'd probably read it as 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, which I would say is the correct way to read those figures, because those are the context in which they're presented. But if you look at the B and the 13, they're the exact same image. So we just perceive them differently based on the way they're presented to us. And that's the same as the way we perceive information or claims or assertions or opinions or gossip or hearsay when it's presented to us. The context is incredibly important, not only for how we receive information, but how we develop our identity. So speaking of our identities, I always like to ask my students, are you a product of your environment, or did you choose to be who you are? So for our fourth lecture activity today, go ahead and answer that question. Are you a product of your environment, or did you choose to be who you are? And another way to kind of think about that is, if you were you, the essence of yourself, your awareness, but you were maybe born in a different place on the planet or in a different time period of the planet, would you still be the you that you identify with as today? Would you still have the same likes and dislikes? Would you still eat the same foods? Would you still listen to the same music? Would you still have the same morals and values? Would you still speak the same language? Would you be the same religion? And generally, when I ask students these questions, they say, no, I'd be a completely different person if I was raised in Australia in the 1500s versus, being in America in the 2000s. So it's something to think about, because we become so attached to our identities, and a lot of the way that we think is just an attempt to kind of defend those identities. But if you think about it kind of by zooming out or looking at it in a more macro sense, our identities are also kind of just something that we create and maybe are not actually the essence of who we are, but in fact are malleable and flexible and kind of ever-changing. For our fifth lecture activity today, what I would like for you to do is make a list of 10 words that describe who you are, whatever that means to you. write down 10 words that describe who you are. So if you were to kind of ask yourself, who am I? In order to answer that question, basic information would not be enough. You'd have to include all your physical characteristics, all your emotional characteristics, secrets you've never told anyone, feelings that you're not proud of, the content of your unconscious mind, which, for most of us is stuff that's not accessible. So when you look at that list of 10 words that you just wrote down, are they mostly good? Are they mostly bad? Characteristics or traits or behaviors. Most students only write down good things. Our ego prevents us from being able to see that stuff in our unconscious or to see our weaknesses and our limitations. And some students can't write down 10 words, which might be an indication that we do need to work on self-awareness and we need to be able to figure out who we are as people and what comprises our identity. A lot of what we're going to practice in this class to be better critical thinkers, in order to really figure out our identity and who we are, is to be more self-aware, to kind of try to see if we can't look into that unconscious and figure out where our reactions and emotions and behaviors and thoughts kind of come from that maybe we've forgotten or stuffed down or are embarrassed or ashamed by. We have a tendency to think about ourselves or to prefer what Chris Rock says is our representative. So when people ask us who we are, we tend to only share good things. Or even when we think about who we are, we try to mostly only think of the good things. I'm a nice person, I'm a smart person, I'm a friendly person. But the reality is that humans are complex and we're all of it. We're the dark and the light. We're the good and the bad. There's moments in our life that we're not proud of. There's skeletons in our closet. There's things that we're embarrassed by. But even those things that we consider to be bad or embarrassing or don't want to share with people are actually wonderful because they helped us to develop kind of who we are today and learn from our mistakes. And so we're going to try to acknowledge them in different ways so that we can be more honest with ourselves, so that we can be more objective, and so that our ego doesn't stand in the way of our critical thinking. So, do you really know who you are? What is in your unconscious mind? Why are you the way you are? Did you choose to be this way? Or are you a product of your environment? Or is it a combination of both? So, what I'd like you to do is start kind of thinking about those questions. What motivates my behaviors, thoughts, and feelings? Where did they come from? They don't just come out of thin air, right? So, did I get them from my parents? Did I get them from celebrities that I think are interesting? Did I get them from different philosophers that I think are interesting? Did I learn them from observing people in my life that are important to me? So I want you to kind of start to think about those subtle things that kind of happen before your behavior, before your thoughts, before your feelings that precede them. What's making you think, act, and feel the way you do? So, as we were previously talking about, we are definitely influenced by the time and place in which we live. So, when you're thinking about your identity or your own individuality, it's important to think about in which ways you've kind of been molded by your culture and by the time in which you're alive. We are the product of the time and place we live in. We're affected by our circumstance, our understandings, our beliefs, our customs. Our current time and place limits our experiences. I'm here at this time on this part of the planet, so I don't know what it's like to have grown up in a different time or in a different place, and I might have different attitudes or beliefs or morals or thoughts had I been from a different space or time. And so we definitely know in just very basic ways that the way we perceive the world depends on time and place. For example, just the idea of body image is very dependent on the time and culture in which it's being considered. So I know my mom grew up in the 70s, and she still says that this woman on the kind of top right of your screen, her name was Twiggy. She's like 70 pounds on a good day after eating a sandwich. Uh, but my mom still says that is her ideal body image. That's the ideal image of beauty to her and something that she would strive to want to look like. And so that was in the 70s. And then, in the 50s, we had Marilyn Monroe, who would be, if she was around in our time, would be considered a plus-size model. I think she was a size 16 in the 50s, but those sizes have changed. So I guess she would be like a size 12 today. But that's still a plus-size model, and she was considered like the sex icon of the time. And then in different cultures, in some cultures where resources are scarce, larger women are considered to be the sexiest, because it kind of sends a message that they have access to food and to money. Or women that have larger curves can sometimes send a message that they are more likely to be fertile or reproductive if they have, childbearing hips or large breasts for breastfeeding. So just the way that we perceive even what is attractive depends on the time and place we live. Not to mention the food we eat, or the way different different kind of subcultures of a overall culture are treated. Women, religious groups, different sexual orientations, even kinesphere, how close we stand to one another when we're communicating. In our culture, we stand about 3 feet apart. But in other cultures where there's overpopulation, in specific Asian cultures, their kinesphere is only 1 foot apart, because they just don't have the luxury of extra space due to overpopulation and things like that. So all of these are just very small examples of how we're influenced by the time and place in which we live. So if just how close we stand to people is influenced without us even kind of being aware of that, then certainly the way we think and feel and act is influenced by our surroundings. So for our next lecture activity, can you think of any other examples of how our identities are influenced by the time and place in which we live? If you could write down 2 or 3, that'd be great. So when we think about our identity, we have to consider the influence of mass culture. So I'd ask you to consider, how does mass media affect who you are and how you act and think and feel? We're being influenced by mass culture like never before. It's everywhere. It's convenient. It's pocket-sized. I can be watching the news with news scrolling across the bottom of the screen while getting news updates on my phone and looking on my laptop at news. So there's just this constant influx of information. And by 18, the average person has spent 11,000 hours in the classroom and 22,000 hours watching TV. So certainly those numbers are going to have effect on our perspective. So how does mass culture affect us? How does mass culture affect you personally? So for our next lecture activity, I'd like for you to write down how mass media affects who you are as a person. How has it influenced your identity? Well, we develop these kind of emotional, impulsive, gullible habits of consuming or wanting because that's what we're shown in commercials and in advertisements. We're constantly bombarded with slogans and testimonials by celebrities. And these advertisements are designed to appeal to our emotions and make us feel like we need things in order to be happy. Ads show play as more gratifying than work, materialism as more meaningful than idealism, and self-gratification better than self-control. And then also, mass media weakens our attention span. We have a kind of lack of constant excitement when we're at school or at work. Makes everyday life less interesting and less fulfilling because when we're, on the internet or watching TV, there's all of these different things that are done to keep our attention. Scene shifts, camera shifts, sensory appeals like violence and sex. Next time you're watching a TV show, just watch how many times the camera shifts from one character to another character to one scene to another scene. It's just like rapid fire, because if it's just one steady image, we get extremely bored. We're not used to that. We're used to kind of this constant and layered sense of visual and auditory stimulation through media. Okay, so let's watch this video on the 5 ways that social media affects our brains.
With social media sites being used by 1/3 of the entire world, they've clearly had a major influence on society. But what about our bodies? Here are 5 crazy ways that social media and the internet are affecting your brain right now. Can't log off? Surprisingly, 5 to 10% of internet users are actually unable to control how much time they spend online. Though it's a psychological addiction as opposed to a substance addiction, brain scans of these people actually show a similar impairment of regions that those with drug dependence have. Specifically, there's a clear degradation of white matter in the regions that control emotional processing, attention, and decision-making. Because social media provides immediate rewards with very little effort required, your brain begins to rewire itself, making you desire these stimulations, and you begin to crave more of this neurological excitement after each interaction. Sounds a little like a drug, right? We also see a shift when looking at multitasking. You might think that those who use social media or constantly switch between work and websites are better at multitasking, but studies have found that when comparing heavy media users to others, they perform much worse during task switching tests. Increased multitasking online reduces your brain's ability to filter out interferences and can even make it harder for your brain to commit information to memory. Like when your phone buzzes in the middle of productive work. Or wait, did it even buzz? Phantom vibration syndrome is a relatively new psychological phenomenon where you think you felt your phone go off, but it didn't. In one study, 89% of test subjects said they experienced this at least once every 2 weeks. It would seem that our brains now perceive an itch as an actual vibration from our phone. As crazy as it seems, technology has begun to rewire our nervous system, and our brains are being triggered in a way they never have before in history. Social media also triggers a release of dopamine, the feel-good chemical. Using MRI scans, scientists found that the reward centers in people's brains are much more active when they're talking about their own views as opposed to listening to others. Not so surprising, we all love talking about ourselves, right? But it turns out that while 30 to 40% of face-to-face conversations involve communicating our own experiences, around 80% of social media communication is self-involved. The same part of your brain related to orgasms, motivation, and love are stimulated by your social media use, and even more so when you know you have an audience. Our body is physiologically rewarding us for talking about ourselves online. But it's not all so self-involved. In fact, studies on relationships have found that partners tend to like each other more if they meet for the first time online rather than with a face-to-face interaction. Whether it's because people are more anonymous or perhaps more clear about their future goals, there's a statistical increase in successful partnerships that started online. So while the internet has changed our verbal communication with increased physical separation, perhaps the ones that matter the most end up even closer. Speaking of social media, we had you ask us questions on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Tumblr, Google+, and every other social platform we could find, and did a Q&A video over on ASAP Thought. So if you feel like getting some insider info on ASAP Science and behind the scenes, check it out with the link in the description. Got a burning question you want answered? Ask it in the comments or on Facebook and Twitter. We also finally got a P.O. box for all of you amazing science lovers who have requested to send us mail or other stuff over the years. And we'd love to hear from all of you, so feel free to use the address on the screen or in the description box. And subscribe for more weekly science videos.
Alright, so the next question to consider is, are your behaviors and beliefs conditioned in you? Are you even aware of what influences your behaviors and beliefs? Or are you just kind of involuntarily doing the behaviors and having the beliefs without even realizing that you've kind of been trained to have them? So this idea comes from mainly Ivan Pavlov and then other psychologists like John Watson and B.F. Skinner. But Ivan Pavlov made manipulation a science, and he called this classical conditioning. So let's go ahead and watch a video on classical conditioning.
Behavioral psychologists have come up with new views, not only of animal behavior, but of human nature as well. And these views all concern a process that we take for granted, learning, because we are all truly born to learn. Ironically, one of the most important figures in the study of learning, Ivan Pavlov, wasn't concerned with the subject at all, at least not at first. Pavlov, a noted Russian scientist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904. As this original footage shows, Pavlov was initially interested in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dog salivated quickly, an inherited salivary reflex. But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dog salivated before contact with the food. Just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way. Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic, unlearned response. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned. Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and a response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened. Pavlov's work, and the work of those who followed him, led to a remarkable conclusion, and that is, any stimulus an organism can perceive is capable of eliciting any reaction the organism is capable of making. This means that virtually any sound, sight, or smell can influence the way our muscles tense or relax, our moods fluctuate, or even the way our attitudes are formed. For instance, if I say, relax, and then do this, you're going to be startled and upset. After 5 or 6 pairings of relax, just saying the word relax is going to generate a negative response rather than its usual learned reaction.
John Watson kind of took the works of Ivan Pavlov and built upon them. He applied classical conditioning to human emotion in a very famous experiment known as the Little Albert experiment. And as a result of the Little Albert experiment, Watson kind of abandoned the field of psychology and went to teach ad agencies how to appeal to emotions when trying to get people to buy products rather than logic. So he kind of taught advertising agencies how to use classical conditioning to get us to buy things, so that we'd be buying things without thinking, just feeling like we like them or feeling like we need them, and then purchasing them without any reason or critical thinking processes. So let's go ahead and watch a video on Watson's Little Albert experiment.
Give me a baby, and I can make any kind of man. These are the words of John B. Watson, the founder of behaviorism. According to this worldview, the behavior of organisms, including human beings, is predictable and therefore controllable. In 1920, at Johns Hopkins University, Watson experimented on several babies ranging in age from 3 months to a year. The experiments were remarkable in their simplicity. He would present a candle to infants to see if they were afraid of fire. He would introduce animals to their environment to see if the children were afraid of them naturally, or only after a traumatic experience. He would make a hissing noise and observe the results. Watson learned that newborn babies had no fear of the dark. He also learned, however, that such fear could be conditioned. and so it was with rabbits. This baby, known as Little Albert, initially found delight in touching a rabbit. Yet, as Watson began to clang a steel rod and claw a hammer behind the child's head whenever he touched the creature, the reaction became not one of delight, but terror. Soon, the mere sight of the rabbit would elicit fear, even when no noise was provided, a fear that also extended to objects and textures of a similar type. From his experiments, Watson reached a radical conclusion which would come to define political and social engineering in the 20th century. The driving force in society, he claimed, is not love, but fear.
So these strategies of manipulation, like Pavlov and Watson used, are still effective and used today in advertisements by politicians. And studies show that we are very easily manipulated, but most of us think that we are impervious to manipulation. So one of the ways that we can kind of consider this idea of manipulation is just through the lens of conformity. In what ways do we just conform to what other people are doing without really thinking for ourselves? So we're going to watch a elevator experiment on conformity that was done by one of the leading researchers on conformity named Solomon Asch. And as you watch it, think about how you would behave in the elevator if you were witnessing this.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with the white shirt, the lady with the trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. Here's the candid subject. Here comes the candid camera staff, 3 of them at least. And this man has apparently been in groups before. Now, here's a fella with his hat on in the elevator. First he makes a full turn to the rear and Charlie closes the door. A moment later, we'll open the door, everybody's changed positions. Now we'll see if we can use group pressure for some good. Now, in a moment, on Charlie's signal, everybody turns forward. Notice they take off their hats. And now, do you think we could reverse the procedure? Watch.
So most people, when they watch this video, think that they wouldn't have behaved like those bystanders did and conformed to kind of turning around in the elevator and taking your hat off. And Ash did a variety of stories on conformity. Like this other one, if you look at the slide, you'll see that there's a standard line and then there's 3 comparison lines. And so what he would do is get a bunch of actors and then one unsuspecting person to say which comparison line matched the standard line. And he'd have all the actors go before the kind of participant that didn't know what was going on. And all the actors would say that line 1 matched the standard line. And by the time he got to the actor, after listening to person after person say, oh, line 1 matches the standard line, line 1 matches the standard line, then the unsuspecting person would also just kind of conform and say line 1 matches the standard line. And so this is what we see kind of happen with us as humans. For our next lecture activity, I'd like for you to write down, if you were in Ash's study, if you think that you would have also said line 1 matches the standard line. And also tell me, which ways do you think you conform? We're kind of constantly conforming without even thinking about it. If you wear clothes in public, you're conforming. If you're driving on the right side of the road, you're conforming. And these are all really good ideas and necessary for a society to function. We need this cooperation. We need this conformity. If you were to go out into the world without clothes, you'd get arrested. If you were to decide that you're going to be a nonconformist and drive on the left side of the road, you'd get in a car accident. So it's necessary for us to conform. We just don't want to do so mindlessly, without thinking, without any awareness, because then we're not critical thinking at all. So many of the beliefs that we have been planted in our minds and replayed, reinforced for years by politicians and advertisers. They reinforce what they want us to think by repeating their slogans until we stop thinking for ourselves. So the idea is that we just want to make sure that as individuals, we're thinking for ourselves. One of the things that I always tell students is that in order to be a strong critical thinker, you really have to shed your ego. And so that can be maybe contradictory sounding coming from a psychologist, because for years psychologists have placed this like mass importance on self-esteem. There were all these studies done that were telling teachers and parents to just build up self-esteem in people kind of arbitrarily, that now we see this epidemic where everyone that participates in a sport gets a trophy, right? And so the idea is based on some good theory that if you believe that you can achieve things, you're more likely to achieve them. And there is truth to that. That's not false. The problem is that it's kind of being taken too far in certain instances, and people are having all of this confidence that's not really based on achievement or accomplishment. And so it's creating what researchers are now saying is a sense of entitlement. So some of these studies that were really encouraging just this kind of blind, arbitrary self-esteem building was done by this woman who was actually trying, she was a teacher, and she was actually trying to do a study about like racism and stereotypes, but it ended up being a little different than she expected. So she told the students in her class that students with blue eyes were smarter than students with brown eyes. And then she gave them a test, and of course, the students with blue eyes really did do better than the students with brown eyes. And then she came back a couple weeks later and said, you know what, I gave you misinformation. I mixed that up. It's actually the brown-eyed students are smarter than the blue-eyed students, and then gave them another test. And this time, the brown-eyed students did significantly better than the blue-eyed students. So there are many studies like that were kind of lending themselves to support the idea of, hey, let's just build confidence in people, and then they will be more successful. Prior to studies like these, people believed that hard work was what created self-esteem. They were encouraged to be self-disciplined, self-critical, practice self-denial, which is like another word for fasting, and to aim for self-knowledge and self-awareness. And what used to be considered self-centeredness is now kind of what we're seeing being referred to as self-esteem. There are other studies besides the one that I mentioned about the blue-eyed versus brown-eyed students that also show that this current emphasis on self-esteem doesn't always equal success. In fact, some studies have found that it can actually cause problems. Like mentioned earlier, a sense of selfishness, entitlement, self-centeredness, ignorance, depression, financial problems. So it's not all good to just have this kind of arbitrary self-esteem. But maybe we need more of a balance, to believe in our capabilities, but also to base our self-esteem on some form of achievement. And it doesn't have to be monetary or scholarly or academic or whatever. It can be, being a nice person, for example. So Frankl is a psychologist who actually survived the Nazi concentration camps, and he based his research on studying what the human experience is all about. Why are we here? What are we doing? And what he found is that we're all here kind of searching for meaning. And so he argues that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which many of you have probably seen before, is basically incomplete, right? That it's correct. We do need to kind of go through these needs in this order, and we do that naturally, instinctively. So we need our physiological needs met before we can move on to trying to have our safety needs met, housing, being in a safe neighborhood. And then after we've accomplished that, then we can move on to focusing on belongingness, joining organizations, churches, Girl Scouts, schools, finding relationships and our love needs. And then after that, we can start to work on our esteem needs, certain accomplishments, goals that we have. So Frankl said all that's correct, but he also added a few other elements like the need to know and understand and aesthetic needs to recognize the patterns and beauty in the world. And then Maslow had that self-actualization need, which is to kind of become almost enlightened, to be a fully functioning version of yourself, to become completely self-aware, and therefore knowing all of your strengths and weaknesses, and then being able to kind of improve upon your weaknesses and play to your strengths. And there's a lot of other elements into self-actualization, but that's kind of a brief overview. And so Frankl said that we also have a need that's maybe even higher than the need for self-actualization. He said it's called self-transcendence, and it's the need to not be absorbed with ourselves. He says that we become fully human when we stop asking life to give to us and start asking what it wants from us, and that this challenge is what brings us that meaning and fulfillment that we're all here looking for and needing. And he says that in order for a person to be happy, that it's an anthropological fact that we need a cause to serve or a person to love. So something outside of ourselves to kind of focus on and to find meaning from. And so if you kind of take that into consideration, then maybe our purpose or our focus shouldn't just be about ourselves if we're trying to really kind of grasp true happiness in our lives. Okay, so to sum up this chapter, the idea is that our identity or our individuality is not something that we are born with, but instead it's something that we acquire. And we need to understand that it's impossible to not be influenced by other people in our environment and our culture. So the essence of individuality then is vigilance, is self-awareness. So some instructions for becoming more of an individual, someone who thinks for themselves and is less likely to conform mindlessly or be so influenced by our society or be manipulated by advertisements and politicians and these types of things, is to first treat your first reaction to any person, issue, or situation as tentative. So if someone makes a claim or makes an assertion or tells you their opinion on something, kind of pause for a second before you draw a conclusion. No matter how appealing the position is, refuse to just accept it until you've kind of taken it apart and examined it more. And then decide why you acted as you did. So when someone gives you an assertion or a statement or says something to you, and you have this reaction, these thoughts, feelings, or actions, think about, did I borrow that reaction from a friend, from a TV show, from a parent? Is it possible that I was conditioned to respond this way? What past experiences may have evoked this reaction? And then third, think of other possible reactions that maybe people from other perspectives or points of view might have. So think of other possible reactions that a person could have had to that person or that issue or that situation. And hopefully this should start to kind of open our minds to some possible alternatives for next time. The idea is we just want to kind of consider our options here when we're thinking of other possible reactions. And then fourth, ask yourself, one of those other reactions that you just considered is more appropriate than your first reaction. And when you answer that question, resist the temptation to condition yourself. Even when you answer that question, don't kind of be attached to it. Don't marry yourself to it. You still want to keep an open mind. All right, that's it for chapter 1. So head on over to Canvas and complete the rest of the assignments for this module.